Thinking big. That's what we did this week in the seminar. We looked at historical scholarship that is big in scope. That can mean big across time or across space. And it's a type of history that is one of many types, and it's very valuable. I think for Southeast Asian history, the most famous case of a really kind of big history would be Victor Lieberman's Strange Parallels, a massive two-volume study that looked at the kind of the move towards centralization in states and kingdoms in Southeast Asia in the medieval and early modern periods, and looked at that alongside the similar developments in places like Europe and then other parts of the world that didn't quite fit the same patterns, so that weren't part of these strange parallels. Stuff like that is great because it lets you see patterns that you didn't really realize were there when you're focusing on, say, your own individual area of interest. So I wanted to look at something like that this week, but rather than reading a single work, what we decided to do was to look at several articles, and all articles created by a single scholar. As another goal of this week was to try to get a sense of what the productive output of a very productive scholar looks like. And so we focused on the work of Eric Tagliacozzo, a professor at Cornell University. And in past years, I've used his book in seminar. He's got a great book that looks at borders and the kind of things that moved across borders, particularly in Borneo around the turn of the 20th century. But this time we looked at a whole bunch of his articles, some of which are really big in scope, looking at things over a 1,000-year period. Others are more focused in time, but still looking at trends that are happening, say, across the region in Southeast Asia. And from our discussion, a few things came out of the experience of reading this type of scholarship. The first is that this big history in its various forms seems to be the most effective, or at least the most refreshing for a reader, when the historian brings in his or her own research as well. So in the case of this week, Eric Tagliacozzo has some articles on things like the lighting of the Malay-Indonesian archipelago. Basically what he does is he shows how the British and the Dutch built lighthouses and literally lit up the whole seas through the area over a period of time. There's great new primary source information that enters a study like that from colonial archives, particularly Dutch, of course, and British archives. But Eric has similar studies like that where he brings in information that he alone has found in colonial archives and then adds that to these big studies or studies that look at some big trend over time, and that makes the whole thing extra fascinating. In the cases when a historian looks at an issue of, say, big history by only relying on the work of other scholars, by working on secondary scholarship, that sometimes cannot work out as well. And the problem that an historian runs into in such cases is that sometimes the extant scholarship on a certain area or time period or topic just isn't as sufficient or maybe as sophisticated as you really need it to be able to synthesize something bigger. So in reading Strange Parallels, for instance, I always feel uncomfortable in reading the parts about Vietnam because I feel like the information we have about pre-modern Vietnam it isn't extensive enough for someone to really synthesize something larger from yet. And so you need more ground level work. Then finally, the last thing that came up is that what struck me in reading a lot of these things, particularly the articles that include a lot of new primary source information or data, is that these are topics that could really benefit from a digital humanities approach. So that article on the lighting of the Malay-Indonesian peninsula, basically, we can see from the textual information that Eric puts together that a lighthouse was built here, another one there, 2 were set up here in this year. And yes, you do get the sense of how this played out over time. But if you could see that, literally see through a graphic or an animated graphic, the Malay, Indonesian, archipelago light up, that would be really fascinating. Similarly, he has articles on the extraction of natural resources from Borneo over time. And the point is to get a sense of the increasing intensity of all of this over time. And yes, from the textual information, you do get that sense, although it's kind of impressionistic. If we could visualize that, if we could take that data and put it into some program that would then map it out over time or through certain graphics so we could literally see this, that would add an added dimension. And it might show us things that we didn't realize was there by just looking at the textual information. That's the benefit of playing around with digital humanities. So big history is cool history. It's great stuff. It's important that some people are doing it, and some of it, comes out being, I don't know if I want to say stronger than others. Sure, some of it is stronger than others, but it's something we can continue to have fun with if we bring the digital humanities in there and start to visualize these big trends over time.